Hello, everyone. Welcome to the very first episode of the Bowery Mick History Show, the monthly, at least monthly for now, pre-recorded podcast that I'm doing for Bowery Mick History. If you're watching this, you're probably watching on YouTube. And if you're watching on YouTube, you should definitely head over to bowerymickhistory.wordpress.com. Check out the Bowery Mick History blog and other stuff that gets posted there. You should also head over to facebook.com/Bowery Mick. Follow the Facebook page, and you can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Bowery_Mick. So, with this first episode, I decided to invite some of my friends in the history field come on and talk about, how they got into history, how they do history, and what history means to them. So we got my good friend Brandon Benner, Hugh Guffnett, and my best friend in the world, and who's also my partner. I can already hear the comments screaming nepotism, Alex Kirchner. How's everyone doing?
Stellar.
Pretty good.
Yeah.
Pretty good considering.
Yeah. If someone is watching this in like 3 years from now, we are still in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, so we're all talking via Zoom. But anyway, we're not going to let a horrible, deadly global pandemic get us down. So this is a history podcast, and I think a lot of people in the world who aren't historians tend to not really understand why people like history. So I'm gonna start off with that. What got you guys into history, and why do you like history? So anyone wants to start?
That's a good question. I'll go ahead and pick it up. For me, both of my parents are in the military. My mother works at military hospital. My dad was in the reserves. So I grew up with that background and that interest in all things military, which eventually turned into history as I got a little older. I was living in Texas, and I watched John Wayne's The Alamo. I hate that movie now, but when I was like 10 years old, it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. Sitting down and watching on my little TV in my little room in North Texas, and just seeing John Wayne beat the living daylights out of Santa Anna's army was like the coolest thing ever. And that's what got me into history. It started to become a little more narrow as I got older, and my mom took me to my first reenactment when we were living in Texas in like 2011. I was like 9 years old, and they did a horrible thing thinking about it now, but I had this little uniform on, and these cannoneers came out, this little 9-year-old, and asked if I wanted to be like their powder monkey, and I said yes, which now I'm thinking about how just dangerous that was, and how irresponsible, but it set me up to the path where I get to do what I do today. So that's my story, short and sweet.
Yeah, I should probably mention we all just so happen to all be reenactors.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Sadly.
Yeah. So, Alex, how did you get into history? Because I think your story of how you got into history and how you do history is a little different from the three of us.
So I think probably that's mostly because of the history that I'm interested in, and I guess how I got interested in it, because I honestly, and I say this with all the love in my heart for all the friends I have that really like military history, I couldn't give a flying about military history. But I think really for me, it was something for a while that my dad was really into, and that we kind of bonded over that, but he's also into military history. So it was an interesting kind of thing, finding my own sort of path with that. And like a lot of other people who were young and were not into reenacting and stuff, my whole segue into like this universe was embarrassingly maybe American Girl dolls, because it was like this idea that like you could have all these different stories, all these different worlds. And I think that also kind of segues into how I guess I look at history too, that it's this giant story, that we're all storytellers, and it's all of ours to kind of understand and grow from and share. It's a very human experience, and it's just us talking about the human experience. But I think even more interestingly, kind of as I've grown as, I guess, a historian and kind of explored different stories, different paths, I think one of the more interesting things more recently is trying to find how alternate stories fit into the whole narrative, how stories that aren't going to show up in reenactments or in the American Girl doll kind of saga or any other mainstream sort of thing like that. Different stories about obviously different like gender roles, different marginalized groups in history that don't always get the front page of all the things we talk about. And I think it's definitely an interesting thing to do. And again, part of the cool thing about it is that you can kind of never run out of stuff to talk about. Most people kind of see history as something, well, it happened, it's done. There's only so much of it to understand. But there's so much of it that, again, we don't understand because people didn't look at it or didn't talk about it. So it's kind of a never ending story, if you will.
Yeah, that's great. Brandon, last but certainly not least.
So my interest in history started, I would say probably at like age 8, 9, I think. So for a little background on me, I come from central PA, very, very rural part of Pennsylvania, right in the middle. There's a political strategist, Jim Carville. He always said Pennsylvania is, what is it, Pittsburgh in the west, Paoli in the east, and Alabama right up the middle. So that's me, super rural Pennsylvania. So growing up where I did in Juniata County, there's not really a whole lot in Juniata County. There's not really anything of note. There's not really anything to write home about Juniata County. So when I was, probably about 9 or 10, I guess, I went to Gettysburg for the first time. I was about an hour and a half away, and my family took me down there. And I'll admit, my first time there, like, I'm just like, cool, it's a field with pretty carved rocks. Who cares? Whatever. I want to go home and watch Star Wars. But, then I started to learn the stories. I think it was on our 5th grade field trip. A lot of central PA schools, their 5th graders go on the field trip to Gettysburg. So I'd been there before, but I'm like, okay, I'm starting to get a hang of this. I'm starting to pick up some of the stories. While we were there, we were given a tour by a licensed battlefield guide, and he knew we were from Juniata County, and he said, I want to teach you guys about the 151st Pennsylvania Infantry. I'm not going to tell their whole story here, just for the sake of time, even though I literally have a tattoo of their regimental number, like on my chest, like it's my thing. But long story short, a lot of these guys were from Juniata County, from this podunk middle of nowhere place where I spent most of my life. And some would argue that they were integral in saving the Army of the Potomac, or what elements of it were on the field as they fell back on the first day at Gettysburg. These guys were heroes to me when I learned their story. And it kind of taught me, like, yeah, I come from nowhere. I come from nothing. But people who come from the same background can still be worthy of having a story told about them. People from small places can still do big things. And that spoke to me so much. The house that I lived in as a kid was about 100 yards from the cemetery where a lot of these men who were killed at Gettysburg were buried when they were brought home. So it was made all the more real to me. And I think really what it became to me is wherever you go, anywhere, there are hidden stories lying all about in the very earth. You can drive by some old and decrepit and overgrown cemetery and might not even notice it, but buried in that earth, in those bones, there are stories. And the fact that every person has a story, has a new element that they can bring to a historical narrative, Alex, kind of like what you were getting at, that just attracted me so much, and it made me want to draw out those stories wherever I can. I started getting involved in reenacting at probably, I think, about age 11. Hugh, just like you, I started off with artillery, and for some reason they're like, here, come on, carry the powder around to the guns. I'm like, I'm a child. I shouldn't be doing this. But that's really how it started. And I decided it's just what I wanted to do, was not only try to tease these stories out from the hidden fabric around us, but to teach people about these stories and show them why they matter, and try to get people to understand that these stories aren't just something that historians pick up. They're something that you can see every day around you, just if you look hard enough. And that's something that's magical about it to me.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're definitely right that like we are surrounded by history and these stories everywhere we go. Like, I mean, I was born and raised in New York City. That is like crazy. You can't step on the sidewalk without stumbling into something that is like of some historical significance. You know, I mean, I went to high school around a place called Union Square, which April 1861, there was this giant rally to recruit guys to go to war right after Fort Sumter. They actually hung the Sumter flag over the statue of George Washington there, and I walk past that every single day. There are also a couple really awesome Union labor rallies that happened in Union Square, featuring my all-time historical hero, James Connolly. But like everyone else here, like I got into history, from a relatively early age, and it was largely because of my dad. He's a reenactor, so I grew up around like Civil War stuff. My favorite movie growing up was Gettysburg, which is an awful movie, but I still love watching it because it sucks
Stop
so much.
it. Gettysburg's the best movie ever made, Andrew.
I
Quote that all
Glory's pretty
day.
good. I'm a Glory man.
But like I kind of grew up around this stuff, and I went away from it in high school because I went to a software engineering high school. So, and I very, very nearly went down that path to go and write computer code and get a job at Google and actually like be financially stable for the rest of my life. But I didn't because around that same time I started volunteering for the National Park Service, and that like kind of reinvigorated my love of history and introduced me to actually like sharing history. That was when I started going down this path of public history and talking to people about history and why this history that they're surrounded by is so important. That's kind of led to this show right here, the Bowery Mick History Show, and doing all that stuff with Bowery Mick History. So we each do history in different ways. And I put "do history" in air quotes because it's a weird way of saying that. But we all work in the history field in different ways. Some of us do it as our profession. Others do it as a hobby. Others want it to be a profession, but we're stuck in our current situations. So what are some of the ways that you guys do history? Hugh, why don't you go? Oh, Alex.
Sorry, I was like, well, someone's going to talk.
Yeah.
But I think, so obviously, I think reenacting is a really interesting thing, and it comes up in a lot of different ways because it's kind of a contentious thing. And part of the reason why I focused more on my like actual professional career in history as of late and less on like the reenacting end of it, because there's so much of a struggle in terms of how like you do history, and in terms of something that, again, we all do, again, you guys more than me, but in terms of living history, there's a lot of contention with it being something that either you do for fun or you do as an educational thing. And it's an interesting topic because it's an interesting kind of ground to fall in. Because when you talk about doing something for fun, obviously, yes, it's supposed to be fun. You're putting a lot of money into it. It should probably be somewhat enjoyable for you, I hope. But it's also a little bit more than just fun, I think, in the sense of like, oh, like LARPing and being a wizard and like going and like killing pretend dragons or something. I don't know what people do. But I think there's a sense of greater responsibility to it because we do owe the rest of the world a bit of accuracy, I guess, in at least some way, because for a lot of people who don't care about the same stuff that we do, who don't interact with history the same way that we do, we're like all they're really gonna get. Even from like a professional standpoint, I would consider myself a public historian. I also work for the National Park Service as like an interpretive park ranger. So everything that we say has significant weight as a public historian, whether it's, again, professionally or as a hobby, as a reenactor, whatever. You do owe it to like yourself and to the rest of the people that you're talking to make it meaningful and to make it real, because they're not going to go out and watch maybe a movie, or especially not like a accurate real movie, a documentary or something like that. They're not going to go read books or go do research on their own. We're kind of the front lines. We're all they're going to get for most of this. And we have to make it actually stick. We have to prove that the stuff we do, remembering these stories, holding on to this stuff, is actually going to mean something. It's going to carry through. So I think, I'm really sorry about my dog, by the way, if you can hear him in the background. But I think it's something that we do have to be careful with. We do have to do with honesty and integrity and authenticity, and a drive to tell all of the stories in the most frank way that we can. So I don't know if that's exactly answering your question, but I think doing history in general terms as public history, whether it's reenacting or it's as a professional thing, it's definitely, it's the same thing in the sense that we have to tell people and we have to make it meaningful in a small moment that we get with folks.
Yeah, you're definitely right on that. Hugh, I think you were gonna say something.
Yeah, no, I mean, I really like what you said, Alex. I think that's kind of my mentality too. I started this as a way to just be around other just really awkward nerds like myself. It's just a really niche area and a really niche interest. So reenacting was just that way to kind of fulfill that inner desire of mine to just to be who I really wanted to be, and to just really live the life that I wanted to live. Somewhere I really didn't have to feel ashamed for being just a nerd and liking what I like, But as I got older, that interest kind of refined, and it became a means to not just tell a story, but to tell a story with a reason behind it. I focus on African American military history, but not just talking about, the bang bang, the pew pew, the battle stuff, more about the inner person that was behind a lot of these actions, behind a lot of these units. What was their role in history? What was their life before the conflict? What did they do after the war? And one of my big specialties is how not just African Americans, but Africans, people of African ancestry across the globe have influenced and progressed society as a whole. Case in point, you have the African American veterans of World War I and World War II who started moving towards what we now know as the civil rights movement, which culminated in the 1950s, 60s, and then the 70s with groups like CORE, SNCC, even the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. How did African American soldiers, play a role in that? What did they do? How did their service, in Europe fighting Nazis, or in the Pacific fighting the Imperial Japanese Army, or in Italy fighting fascist, Italian soldiers? How did that experience, how did being in France and experiencing for the first time what equality more or less felt like, how did that influence their homecoming? And it turned into less of a way to just be a nerd and to have that outlet to channel that passion into more of a way to, I guess in essence, open people's minds and open people's hearts, and use it as a tool to progress social change, I guess is how I can best describe it. One, with African American history, there's the fact that history is not well told in this country and across the world too. So with that, you're able to give people of African ancestry in this country and various countries across the globe this sense of pride in that story and in themselves and their family and their ancestry and the blood that runs through all of our veins. But two, for those that don't have that same ancestry, that history, that background, that connection to it, to help them understand that this country, the world, wasn't just developed, built, run by white people, that there were quite a few other people of various different backgrounds, various different identities that played a key role in creating the world that we know today. So I do that through my hobby side, which is, the USC Trooper Instagram page that I run, doing living history. But I also work for the National Medal of Honor Heritage Center out in Chattanooga, Tennessee, doing virtual programs for students in secondary levels, so like 6th grade to like senior in high school, on African Americans in the Civil War, with an emphasis on how did their contributions 155 years ago impact us today. So as Alex said, there is no direct way that I do history, and it comes in a few different forms, but there tends to be that underlying reason why I do it, and what I tend to hope that people get out of what I do, that I think makes it unique for me. But yeah.
Brandon?
Sure. Well, I want to start off and say, everyone here is a lot smarter than I am. I just want to say that, just to start off with.
No.
You guys,
No, that's not true.
I mean, so for anybody listening, I'm actually the oldest person on this podcast right now. I'm turning 26 in, a month or so. But these guys are all so accomplished, and I'm so proud of the historians that they have become. So me, the way I do history, I kind of describe myself as, a little more of as I'm kind of a slow burn. So I, like I said, I started in reenacting. I started off, very interested in military history. And then when it came time for me to go to college, I went to Penn State, and I decided I wanted to study history and political science. Honestly, I shouldn't have even done political science and just focused on history, to be honest. But I decided, well, naturally, I'm so into history, I need to study history. So in my time there, I did 2 internships with the National Park Service at Gettysburg the summer after my freshman and sophomore years. And I think that's what set me on the course of wanting to do public history like you guys do in one capacity or another. It really showed me that, there is a very specific technique to speaking to the public about history and trying to impart a narrative, but being very careful about constructing that narrative. Ever since then, I think my interest in history has evolved. It's not just military history, anymore, which is why I was doing, reenacting. 1, it was fun. 2, it was a cool way to kind of experimentally on your own get a better understanding of military history. However, once I did that internship, and the more I progressed in my college education, I realized that I think I started to develop a more of an interest in a social history, a political history, in a way. So shortly after I graduated, I moved to Baltimore, and I took up a job with historic ships in Baltimore, a maritime museum in Inner Harbor, and I mainly was working on USS Constellation. She's the last floating warship from the Civil War, and the largest floating example of Chesapeake Bay shipbuilding. But I found myself, what I was doing in my time when I was working at Constellation was I was using the site that I was given, the historical resource that I was given to work with, and using it to kind of play with history in different ways. Have visitors look at the stories of the men who served on Constellation in different lenses. I remember one tour I gave of the ship, I went at it at a class lens. How do these sailors who probably came from low working class backgrounds in New York and Boston, how does that compare to the officers of this ship who probably, received a recommendation to the Naval Academy from a congressman that they knew. So the way I do history, that's the way I like to do it, is looking at social aspects of our country's history from different angles that maybe the American public doesn't commonly think about. I like to dispel misconceptions that people have. That's one of my favorite things to do, and make people sit back and think, why did I think that? Why was that my conception of what this point in history looked like? So that's something I've always loved to do, and I can't wait to get back into working at a museum or a park or any other historical resource I have. Unfortunately, right now, I'm just Historic Ships in Baltimore had to furlough most of its staff through the coronavirus. So we're eagerly waiting to get back aboard ship, whenever that may be. And right now, I'm working full time for this window company I've been with for a while. So I'm taking this time to just refine my skills and just keep learning and picking up nuances of history that maybe I didn't understand before. And I'm doing what I can to listen to smart people like you. And I'm serious. I like hearing the way you guys talk about the way you do history, and it makes me want to take some pointers for what I can do in the future, wherever I may go, be it a museum or the National Park Service or who knows. But right now, I am just I'm sharpening the blade, and I'm taking lessons on that from guys like you. So I appreciate hearing everything that you guys have been talking about.
Thank you, Brandon. And you guys all touched on a lot of great points. The way I've been doing history a lot more recently is I've been taking more of a informal approach, because like one of my big influences is our good friend John Heckman, whose whole tagline is, "You don't need to be a Tweedy PhD tenured professor to be able to do history." So I take a more informal approach and basically talk to people about history like I'd be talking to them in a bar, you know. So if it were not the COVID era, we could all just sit down like the Gary Owen in Gettysburg or some other place, have a few pints. This is exactly what I'd be doing.
Yep.
But that's not all of it though, because I do take influences from a lot of other people, and Hugh, Alex, they've also both been big influences on the type of stories that I focus on and the way in which I focus on them. Hugh, recently, last month actually was a huge help in one of my favorite Bowery Mick history blog posts on the siege of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. He actually introduced me to stories of these black American units that were there, who don't get that, the recognition that the 101st Airborne Division gets, the overall memory of the battle. And so he was a big help with that. And that mentality of shedding light on the stories that get cut out of the mainstream story has been a big driving force behind what I do with Bowery Mick history. And Brandon, like you said, I also like to dispel myths. One of the more controversial Bowery Mick history blog posts was titled "The Problem with the Lost Cause," and it just went through Confederate government documents from 1861 to 1865 and basically said, hey, it was about slavery from the beginning to the very end. But yeah, that's been that stuff like that has been a big driving force behind the stuff that I do with Bowery Mick history. It's definitely something that I want to continue going forward. So this one's going to get a bit more philosophical. All right, this question: what does history mean to you?
Well, tell you what, I'll go first on this one. So, this is a conversation that I have had to actually have with some of my coworkers recently, not historians, with coworkers at this window and door company I work at. So over the summer, after George Floyd was murdered, of course, a lot of people, started becoming more and more active in the BLM movement. And so there was more and more of a discussion, especially over the past summer, especially with white folks. I think it started to become more to the front for white folks about how we need to address the racist past of our country. And of course, among that is how we memorialize the Confederacy. And I remember it was my direct supervisor actually, was all upset about it and said, we're destroying history. And I said, no, she was referring to destroying Confederate monuments or removing them. And I said, that's not what history is. And she said, oh, well, how would you feel if they started taking down monuments at Gettysburg, huh? I'm like, settle down. Let's talk about this. So what history means to me, too many people conflate history and memory, and I'm not going to try to get into this whole philosophical discussion because this could be a whole podcast in and of itself.
Oh, it will be.
I can't wait for that. That'll be fun. So I had to explain, and this was weird for me because I had to lecture my direct supervisor, who was like 10, 15 years older than me about this. And I had to explain, look, memory is different from history. History is everything that happened, whether we're taught about it or not. And it's incumbent upon us as human beings and as responsible citizens in the society in which we live to try to tease out the stories that are lying beneath the surface. It's incumbent upon us to break down the whitewashed, sugar-coated narratives that we've been spoon-fed since we were 5 years old about what our country has come from. History, to me, it means taking up that responsibility, taking up that mantle. If you're going to do history, like what we've talked about, you must be prepared to handle the difficult questions. You must be prepared to make people uncomfortable because history is inherently uncomfortable. You will not always be proud of what your country has done in history. And that, I think, is something that people should be more prepared for. I think to put a bow on this, what history is for me is a discipline. And I know it's often referred to, it's an academic discipline, but discipline in the deeper sense that you need to discipline yourself when you take this up, whether you're a professional historian or whether you're just an average citizen. This is a discipline. You must understand that this will not always be easy, but it is your duty, I think, to try to understand this, to understand the deep and twisted and sometimes dark and difficult twists of our past. Yeah, I don't really know what else to put after that, but that's what it is to me.
No, that's great.
I like that.
Yeah. Hugh, what is history to
Sure.
you?
So, what history means to me has changed a lot, as I've gone through the almost 19 years of my life. In middle school, elementary school, even, early high school, history felt more like the relating of just facts, names, dates, places, just these concrete things versus, big ideas, concepts, stories rather. It was more like memorize this date, this event, this person, and that is all history is. As I got older, I met an awesome person by the name of Marvin Alonzo Greer and another incredible person by the name of Cheney McKnight. Marvin operates under the tag on Instagram and Facebook, MAG, the historian, and Cheney is Not Your Mama's History. I highly encourage you guys to check them out if you get the chance to. But they, around like my sophomore year, freshman year, end of my freshman year of high school, they helped me realize that history wasn't just that. It was really more about stories, and it was an opportunity to kind of, as Brandon was saying, kind of an opportunity to change the narrative in a more positive light. So as I kind of started talking about with how I do history, I use it as a tool, and that's how I tend to see it as that tool for opening people's hearts and minds, and as a resource for having and facilitating conversations that are, happening across this country today, especially as, Brandon said, in the wake of the George Floyd murder, Breonna Taylor, even going back to Ahmaud Arbery, and even further back to like Trayvon Martin. And especially again, in the wake of, was that January 6th, when, these neo-fascist, loons supporting the so-called president of the United States invaded the United States Capitol, walked through the front doors and defaced it with poop and carried Confederate flags and all this nonsense. To me now, and how I view it is, it's definitely as that tool for facilitating those conversations, for moving things forward. It's less of that hobby view that I used to have, where it kind of exists along that lines of just remembering those names, dates, and places, remembering these concrete facts. Where I remember when I was first getting into living history, I used to do interpretation by talking about, this is unit XYZ, and unit XYZ was at Hill 123, shooting at the 26th Virginia Volunteer Infantry Regiment, from 4 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock in the morning, when they had to retire because they ran out of ammunition. And that concept it's evolved into more understanding of less that concrete idea, but more, well, why were the men of unit XYZ on Hill 123 to begin with? As Brandon was saying before, with how he does that interpretation at the Baltimore Ship Museum, it's those passions, those reasons, that inner conflict that people has that motivates them to fight. In the case of African American soldiers in World War II, why would they put on that uniform when they know that they're being assaulted by state troopers in the Deep South as they're going on their maneuvers in states like Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi? Black soldiers are being lynched, in uniform on military installations like Fort Bragg in 1941, but I believe the name of the individual was Felix Hall. Why would people do that? And those questions is really what drove me to change the meaning of what history is for me, from that concrete idea that I talked about of names, dates, and places, to that tool, that resource for facilitating conversations and opening hearts and minds. So hopefully I answered. It's a difficult question. I was glad Brandon spoke up first, because I was really trying to think about it, but that's the best I could answer.
The most difficult questions get you the best kind of conversations.
That's true.
Yeah. So, Alex, what does history mean to you?
So first of all, I do have to say that I really like both of what you guys have said. And I'm actually very glad that both of you spoke before me, because I was typing little notes. I was like, oh, I should think about that and talk about that thing. But so I actually, I kind of like you, Hugh, I kind of at least wanted to be, or thought about history in a much more, maybe not quite as like rigid fact, like memorization sort of way, but I know at least I did want to be like a tweedy historian at one point. Like I wanted to go to Princeton, and then I wanted to go work for the NPS and just talk about things that I liked, and then maybe write a book about it. And I can't believe that I was ever that person, honestly, at this point in my life, because I have come so far from any of those kind of goals in terms of how I think about history and what it means to me and how I do it. Because I think that, of course, I mean, again, all of this, we're doing this, we talk about this because it's something that we enjoy. For instance, I really love, like, one of probably my favorite thing to talk about history related is the Roosevelts. And I wanted to grow up. When I grew up, I wanted to go and I wanted to work for the NPS at FDR's house and talk about things that I like to talk about and be all smart about it. But I mean, I'm very lucky that I do get to actually work at FDR's house, get paid real money to work for the NPS and talk about it. But that's not really what it's about for me at this point. And I'm so, again, glad that I've changed so much over the last, I guess, 10 years, because I think it's, again, like you guys were saying, it's something that you can use as a tool for helping and teaching people. But personally, on a very like internal, I guess, personal level, I've always been a very introspective person. I've always been someone who wondered a lot about what it meant to be alive, a human being, where I fit into the world. And I think history as a tool, as some of you guys were saying, can be in some ways best applied in showing everybody that they have a place in the world, that they belong somewhere, because history is about everything. Like Brandon was saying, it's about all of this stuff. It doesn't care whether or not people are talking about it. It's all the stuff that happened, whether or not it's being broadcasted or made into movies or whatever. And ultimately, I think that we need to, again, be moving away from those stories and talking about places and people that don't necessarily fit into the cis hetero patriarchal white idea of what history is supposed to be. So the best way that we can use it is to show people that everybody, every single human being, no matter how weird you are, what place you fit in, what places you don't fit in, who claims you in their group, what group you claim to be a part of, that everybody has a little sliver of history of people that came before them, who were like them, who thought like them, who felt like them, who cared about them like them, I guess. I don't know, I'm getting a little, I guess, tangential here, but I think it's really about just all of us being able to realize that we belong somewhere, that we have a place in this giant story of humanity, and that we matter ultimately. Like, I guess that is a really personal sentiment, but it helps me derive a sense of meaning in my own life by seeing how everybody else before me meant something too, even if they were small, even if they weren't people that other people remembered or talked about. We all matter because we're all tiny pieces of this giant multi-wheel puzzle of humanity.
I love that. Andrew, but before you go, do you mind if I add something to what Alex said real quick? It kind of relates. I'm a freshman at the Howard University, and we have a public history department within the history department at Howard. Long story, we're not going to go into it. But during COVID, the individual kind of runs that quasi department held a few not interviews, but just guest speakers, I guess you could say, who were African Americans who were somehow associated with Howard, who were in the history field. And one of them is a superintendent for one of the NPS regions in Alabama. So she manages the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site. There's a small museum on Carver, I believe, at Tuskegee University in Alabama. That's kind of her area. There's an individual there, Dr. Eaton Martinez, who's kind of become a mentor of mine. We had spoken offline on a Zoom call afterwards, and he kind of asked me, because I want to go in the museum field. I really want to do what Alex does. I want to work for the National Park Service or some other federal museum entity. And at the time, I just wanted to talk about what I enjoyed, which was, that social history as it pertains to African Americans as a whole. But he brought me down a little bit and opened my eyes to the idea of, it's not really what you want to talk about that matters. It's what people need to hear. So he used the example of an exhibit that was done at the National Museum of American History in, I believe, the 90s. That was about the Great Migration in around the turn of the century, where African Americans are moving from the agrarian South to the modern urbanized North, escaping just the horrendous conditions that they're faced there. And he used that as an example to talk about how this individual set up this display in a way that it wasn't just a curator going off on a nerdy rant about what the Great Migration was, but it was a way to connect with people's stories and give them that spotlight, that opportunity to express how they feel, to do history on their own terms. So it's not some bougie college-educated person with a PhD, telling their story. It's them controlling their own narrative. So he went and he interviewed surviving, individuals who had actually physically gone through that northern migration, or the grandchildren of those who had moved their entire families from states like Alabama, South Carolina, Tennessee, to Detroit, Michigan, to Chicago, New York City, in search of that better opportunity, much like what my family did, where my grandmother, brought my mother and her siblings to Brooklyn, New York from Jamaica, and an opportunity to create a better future for my family, the future that I'm able to now, really take advantage of, being a college student, doing what I do today. But it gave people the opportunity to take that history and really take ownership of their story, for public consumption. So I really like what you said, Alex. It really isn't so much about us just talking about what we want to talk about. It's more doing it in a way that honors those that actually did it, telling their story in a truthful manner, and doing it in a way that they still kind of maintain that ownership of that narrative. And that also kind of ties into how you had talked about you do your history, Andrew. That same kind of informal, having this conversation at a bar or a pub, kind of like what John Heckman does, versus that super academic heavy lingo that professors and other more upper class bougie historians tend to use. It's a longer story. I didn't mean to cut you off there, Andrew, but I think it kind of had some parallels, wavy parallel, but still parallel to what Alex had said earlier.
Don't be sorry, man. Like, part of my mentality is that, and I think it's safe to say that pretty much everyone here would agree, everyone has a right to history. It is not, there's no bit of history that is like only for one person. We have a right to these stories. We have a right to know these stories, to share these stories. I think anyone who thinks, to be a historian, you have to, have a PhD and wear a tweed all the time and be this very, very dignified, formal individual. No, that's not how it fucking works. And, that's kind of like the mentality that, I and a number of other people have been going with. And I encourage more people who are listening, or those who are here, to go with that mentality of, history is for everyone. History is about everyone. And I also want to say, I definitely agree with that sentiment of, you don't always get to tell the stories that you want to tell. Sometimes you have to tell the stories that need to be told, that people need to hear. Because like most of the stuff that went up on Bowery Mick history over the summer, I did not plan any of those. Like, I had a list of things that I wanted to talk about, and that list went into the trash can because more important shit needed to be talked about. And I think it's the mark of any good historian to understand, history influences the present. And what you are saying as a public historian, it serves a very important purpose. And I think not a lot of people fully grasp just how important history is in present day society. It is absurdly important. I get in arguments with high school students now who think history is dumb and is just dates and names, when really it's understanding the why and the how of today.
I think, actually, if I can throw in a thought, but I think between what you had said after I had spoken to you, and then Andrew, what you were saying, it kind of, one of the things that always actually kind of makes me laugh at my job is because technically, I guess I'm an interpreter, right? And people are like, oh, what language do you speak? And I'm like, well, I can speak a little Spanish, but that's not what we're talking about here. And I think it's a really interesting thought. I was thinking about like the word like interpretation or interpreter, because from kind of what all of us have been saying, it's an interesting word to use to describe what we do, because what does an interpreter do? Well, in a very like traditional, again, like language sense, it's someone's half of the conversation that someone else is hearing, listening, understanding, digesting, and then sharing with someone else to make it so that two different groups of people who otherwise would be divided by, in this case, language, but in our case, time, that they can have a conversation. that people can talk to and understand and hear from and feel a part of the people that came before them, of the past as a general thing, and to feel connected to all this stuff that otherwise, you know, they wouldn't talk about. And ultimately, I mean, there's tons of reasons why we would interpret, why we would facilitate these conversations between the past and the present. But I think, I mean, of course, it's a tool. We have to be telling these stories. We have to be sharing this. We have to be reminding people of the truth of the past. But I think also, again, it's worth reminding people that they have something else in life beyond just like whatever boring 9 to 5 kind of shit we have to deal with anyway. Like, life is kind of boring, not to go all Dead Poets Society on everybody, but like, life is kind of lame if you don't think about it like that. Like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna wake up, I'm gonna watch some TV, I'm gonna go to work, I'm gonna eat my dinner, and then I'm gonna go to bed. And oh my God, I think I would probably like explode or implode if I just had to think about that all day, every day. These stories and being able to have these conversations and to think about how people have always been and how will always be, and all the weird little quirky shit that makes people people. That's what makes being alive worth being alive, because we're part of that story. Someday people are going to want to facilitate those conversations with people from 2020 and 2021 for sure. I can only imagine the things then we're going to have to say. But it's like we're a part of this giant, again, this puzzle, this clock of things that keep happening and will always kind of keep happening, because in some cases people have always had the same sort of situations. We've always felt the same things and thought the same things, even if they weren't about the same topics. People have always been happy and sad and freaked out and scared and in love, and we're really just a part of all those emotions happening again and again throughout time. And who wouldn't want to have a conversation from the past about that? Who wouldn't want to think about little Franklin Roosevelt having anxiety attacks and getting like anxiety rashes? Because I mean, I get anxiety attacks. I have anxiety rashes. Like, well, probably not a rash. That's a little weird, but the point stands. You know, it's something that we can all relate to. Again, like Brandon was saying, no matter how big or small you are, all of this stuff is still relevant to us. It still happens to every human being ever.
I think that's what makes history such an admirable and really a noble discipline, is the fact that I think the reason that we as people through all of time, as long as history has been an academic discipline, the reason history is a thing is because we all hope that one day someone will devote as much time and effort and discipline to telling our story, to telling the tale of our struggle, as we do to telling the struggles of peoples in the past. History is about giving a damn, not just because it's something to do. You know, if that's why you do history, you know, far be it from me to lecture anyone on why they do history, I suppose. But you do it because there's a soul on the other side of it. You do it because when you read about what these people were feeling and thinking, you connect with that immediately. It's the human element of it. You do it because you give a damn about that other person whose words you are reading. And you hope that one day when people are reading about 2020 and 2021 and all the ridiculous shit we're going through right now, you hope someone gives a damn about how you felt, how you were thinking on January 6th when you watched the Capitol be stormed by maniacs. You want people to give a damn about how you felt. And that's what it's all about. It's about humanity telling the stories of humanity for humanity's sake. And that's why I just love this field, because at the end of the day, it's all one big circle, you know? We tell these stories in hope that one day our own stories will be told too.
That's great. That was just great. This got a little more philosophical than I thought it would, but I love it. Well, if anyone doesn't have anything else they want to say, I'd say we could call it on that.
It was a pretty strong note.
Yeah. I'd like to thank you guys for coming on and sitting down, having this little chat. I'd like to thank everyone who is watching, both past, well, not past, but definitely present and future, for sitting down and watching and devoting, it's going to be roughly an hour of your day to listening to four history nerds talk about history. Does anyone want to plug anything before we sign off?
Actually, I did want to say this. I want to say
Yeah.
thank you so much, Angie, for putting this together, giving us this platform to share our beliefs, our views, taking your time to piece this together, to organize this discussion. You know, thank you for telling the stories that you tell. Thank you for doing what you do and doing it so incredibly well. You know, I don't think you get enough credit for the work that you do. So I really want to make sure you definitely get all the praise that you can. You do some incredible stuff, brother. And I'm really glad you reached out to me, and I'm sure Alex and Brandon can back me up here to share our perspectives today.
Oh, well, thank you, Hugh. So we're gonna sign off now. Thank you all for watching. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all for coming here and being a part of this conversation. If you're interested in more of what I do with Bowery Mick History, head on over to bowerymickhistory.wordpress.com. That's where I make blog posts fairly regularly. You can head over to facebook.com/BoweryMick. That's the Facebook page. I post everything there. You can head over to @BoweryMick, Bowery_Mick, I should say, on Instagram and Twitter. I don't really use Twitter that much. Sometimes I do, especially when I'm drunk. No, definitely head over to Instagram. A lot of stuff gets posted there, a lot of interesting stuff. Oh yeah, follow me on Twitch, because I put stuff on Twitch now. And of course, please like and subscribe on the YouTube channel. That helps a lot. All right.